As morning came, we were leaving the mouth of the St. Lawrence. Last glimpse of how big the river is at this point. Then we turned into the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, and then finally we went around the Gaspé Peninsula, left the Gulf behind us, and actually rounded Cape Breton Island once more. As we moved down the coast of Nova Scotia, we went by Sydney, and towards the evening we were treated to a spectacular sunset. The weather was very nice, the ship was quiet, and then in the early morning we could see the lights of Halifax. We entered the harbor at dawn, again with the sun shining off the buildings. And once we docked at the immigration pier, we got on board a bus and headed out towards Peggy Cove. As we went along, we passed the public gardens and a number of other sites, such as the Confederation Building. The scenery was pretty, as in other places, the color was spectacular. As you got close to Peggy's Cove, we saw the sign for the preservation area, and the terrain changed drastically. Instead of a lot of woods, now suddenly you had huge pieces of granite that were left over from the glaciers. And then as we got closer, we came upon the actual village itself. The name Peggy's Cove allegedly comes from a folklore story about a young girl who was abandoned in a storm. See, the village is very pretty, it's very small, surrounded by the granite outcroppings. Of course, the lighthouse is one of the main attractions. Then you have St. Margaret's Bay, and it was a pretty windy day. Fortunately, it wasn't cold, but it was blustery. In this next picture, you'll see the dark rocks, and they're very dangerous. In fact, there are signs all over, keep off the dark rocks, because it's actually lichen, and it's very, very slippery. As we were leaving Peggy's Cove, we passed a memorial to the fishermen that had been sculpted by an artist. And we headed out on the road up on towards St. Margaret's Bay. We passed several small islands. Again, a very scenic route. We also passed a memorial to the Swiss air flight that crashed near Peggy's Cove some years ago. As you drive along, you get one section they call Millionaire's Row, all these fancy houses. And then we headed back into Halifax, went by a number of the tourist sites and historic properties, got off the bus and had lunch at Murphy's on the pier, and then went to visit the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. The museum has a number of different exhibits, small sailing ships, but a lot about the history of Halifax. A lot of artifacts, such as this Fresnel lens, which was used in lighthouses. Figureheads from old ships. Models of the harbor. And in one interesting section, they refer to a series of books that were written in the 1950s about tugboats. And they actually have a real tugboat, Theodore, who wears a hat. One of the major focuses of the exhibits is the Great Explosion of 1917. In 1917, a munitions ship exploded and thousands of people were killed. You can see some of the devastation. These pieces of metal were from one of the ships. Another big exhibit is the Titanic, because many of the victims from the Titanic were brought to Halifax and buried, including a fellow named Jack Dawson, who ends up in the movie Titanic. That's an actual deck chair from the Titanic, if you want to talk about rearranging it. There's a big section on Cunard, because Cunard was a long fixture in the Halifax area. Stanley Cunard came from there. The ships docked for many, many years, and many immigrants came in on the Cunard ships. Outside the museum, there are a number of exhibits, including this World War II escort ship, which was one of the major functions of the Canadian Navy. That night, we sailed out of Halifax and headed back to New York.